my name is Sally Simpson. I am here with Mike Benson, and we are here at the 2022 American Society of Criminology annual meeting. And I have the distinct pleasure today of interviewing Mike for the Oral History Criminology project. And we're going to start with a description of Mike's scholarly productivity, his academic credentials, as well as his academic appointments. So by way of introduction, I should tell you that he is an emeritus faculty member at, currently, I guess, he's emeritus faculty member in the School of Criminal Justice at the University of Cincinnati. He received his master's and bachelor's degrees from Central Michigan University in sociology and his PhD from the University of Illinois in 1982, also in sociology. His first position was as an assistant professor of public and environmental affairs at Indiana University, Purdue University at Fort Wayne. And he was there until 1986 when he moved to the University of Tennessee Department of Sociology. And he moved up the ranks while he was there from assistant professor to full professor and also head of the department. In 2001, he left Tennessee and went to the School of Criminal Justice at the University of Cincinnati, where he remained until he retired in 2020. And so I think it's really important to try to give more of a breadth of what you have done in your career. And we tend to think of people as scholars, and we want to talk about the scholarly work. But one of the things that Mike has done so tremendously is you have a portfolio of service that you have done for the American Society of Criminology, I believe also for the American Sociological Association, service for the Division on White Collar and Corporate Crime. What other service have you done? Because I think it's really important that we talk about this.
What other service have I done?
You were editor, were you not, of The Criminologist?
I am associate editor of The Criminologist and have been so for about 5 years now. And the Criminologist is jointly produced by the vice president of the association and the associate editor. I continue, the vice presidents come and go every year. So my job is to prepare what are called the regular columns that appear in the Criminologist, the doctoral student foreman, the editor's corner, and what we call the secondary essays. The vice president is the person who organizes what we call the lead essay in the Criminologist. So I have done that now for, I'm coming up on my 5th year of doing that, and it's been a lot of fun. Like editing a journal, you get to see a lot of stuff that you wouldn't otherwise see. And it's always fun to work with doctoral students when they are publishing things and they get so excited. So I think that's been my most memorable service contribution recently and what I've enjoyed the most.
Let me also mention that Mike's illustrious career has many books, many publications and scholarly journals, book chapters, and so on. And for that, he has won several important awards that I would like to emphasize. For instance, 2015, he was made a member of the Fellow of the Graduate School at the University of Cincinnati. He was made a Fellow of the American Society of Criminology in 2016. The following year, he was awarded the Gilbert Geis Lifetime Achievement Award from the Division on White Collar and Corporate Crime of the ASC. And then in 2020, he won the Bruce Smith Senior Award from the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences. These are all very important achievements, Mike, and they honor your long and very important career. And I was asked to try to characterize both your areas of specialization or concentration and as well as your major works. And I've already decided I'm going to punt the major works to you. But as I see your record and as I'm familiar with your work, I would say that you have three main areas of concentration. One is an area you and I overlap in, which is white collar and corporate crime, predominantly white collar crime. And then we also overlap in our interests in intimate partner victimization. But then you are a very well-regarded theorist in criminology, and you've published important work on life course criminology, work on self-control, work as well on disadvantage in communities, and those effects on things like intimate partner violence or other issues in those communities. So is that a fair characterization of how you would say your concentrations fall?
It is. I have worked in three areas, mostly in white-collar crime, but I did have a period of roughly a decade where I got very interested in intimate partner violence, in part because at the time that I first started working with it, it suffered from some of the same problems that white-collar crime research sometimes suffers from. How do you define the problem?
Yes, right.
And white-collar crime researchers are always dealing with what counts as white-collar crime. And it occurred to me the same thing happens with intimate partner violence. What counts as violence? What counts as intimate partner violence? Do you include psychological violence? Do you exclude financial exploitation? What counts? And that interested me. And I was also very, very interested in how the community might affect the rate of violence in an area. I felt as a sociologist, it's fundamentally a mistake to always think you can only explain things at the individual level. Individuals live within communities. Their behavior is shaped and pushed in one direction or another by community level factors. This is not to say individuals aren't responsible. They are, but their responsibility arises out of, in part, their positions within communities. That's one of the things that just really interested me when I got into that area, and I was lucky enough to have a colleague at the University of Tennessee, Greer Fox, who, we hit it off, and for some reason she was also interested in this too. We were lucky to get our research funded by the National Institute, by the CDC a couple of times to explore this issue. And the life course criminology, how did that come about? Well, a long time ago, when I published the first version of my white-collar crime book. No, that's not how it came about. I had published a lot in white-collar crime, and an editor at Rutledge asked me to write a textbook, and I said, I'm bored with white-collar crime. I want to do something else. I've heard about this new thing called life course criminology. Would you let me write that? And he did. And I got really interested in how people change over the life course. Also with the community context, because I said, lives don't develop in a vacuum. They develop in communities, and I wanted to talk about that. So I started writing that book, and then when I finished it, out of a sense of obligation, I agreed to go back and write the white-collar crime book for him. But yeah, those are definitely the three areas that I have worked in the most, that I've enjoyed the most. Within those areas, I've tried to explore other issues that I find interesting. Emotions. I'm very interested in how emotions shape behavior and decision making. I know that the rational choice approach has influenced lots of things. I've got no problem with the idea that people are rational and that they try to weigh the costs and benefits. I just think they're really bad at it. And the reason that they're bad is emotions get in the way a lot of the time.
Within these areas of concentration, is there like one work that you think is really a seminal piece that you've produced?
If within the area of white-collar crime, I'm sort of embarrassed to say, but I think the best, in some ways, the best thing I have produced in white-collar crime, at least in terms of citations, was the second article I ever wrote. I wrote an article called Denying the Guilty Mind.
One of my favorites.
Which was, it was different. Nobody had ever done that before. that has gotten many more citations. Back when people used to do reprints in books, they don't do that much anymore. That article has been reprinted, I don't know, 15 or 20 times in edited volumes and things like that. I look back at that even now sometimes, and I think like, that was pretty good.
That was a pretty good piece.
How did
Well, and I know you've revisited The Guilty Mind in an article not too long ago.
And so that, I liked that piece a lot. I also think our book that we have worked on, The Opportunity Perspective, I also think was a good contribution. It, people like it, students like it. I think it raised some interesting questions and asked people to look at the problem of white-collar crime from a different perspective, and that I felt was, a pretty good contribution.
It has gotten a number of citations.
Yes, it has. It's gotten citations too, and it must be doing something because they keep asking us to do new editions.
Fourth edition.
Yeah, there's not many white-collar crime books that make it to the 4th edition. They'll be lucky if this one makes it to the 4th edition. But anyway, so yeah, I thought that was good. In intimate partner violence, I know I did a couple of pieces on community context and the influence of that. I actually sort of forget right now where they were published. I think it was maybe Research in Crime and Delinquency, but
yeah, you have one, neighborhood disadvantage, individual economic distress, and violence against women, that's been highly cited.
Right.
Very influential piece. And your first, the social consequences of self-control, is your most cited piece, which is focused around, self-control theoretically, and denying the guilty mind, both of which appeared in Criminology.
Right. Yeah. So I was proud of those. I guess I was also really proud of the denying the guilty mind because I wrote that by myself. I didn't have any co-authors, didn't really talk to anybody about that. I just sat in my room and thought about my dissertation research and wrote that.
And also heavily informed by neutralization theory.
By neutralization theory and by Garfinkel's status degradation. Goffman, when I was in graduate school, I read everything Goffman wrote and everything Garfinkel wrote, Harold Garfinkel, because I just thought they were on to something about how humans relate to one another and how important the social group is in one's sense of self, Particularly Goffman's work on stigma, I think, really sparked a lot of my interest in white-collar crime, because when I first started doing my dissertation research, the question that interested me was like, well, if you're a middle-class, upper-level executive, how does it feel to have your name splattered on the newspapers? How does it feel to be exposed as a criminal? That sort of sparked what I was interested in.
How does this kind of thinking relate to the special sensitivity hypothesis, which is another, I think, kind of seminal piece that you've developed?
Well, yes,
Along with co-authors.
Frank Cullen and I stumbled across these ideas together, mainly by just talking to one another. I think it relates to it. I mean, we originally thought, or many judges and lawyers had said that white-collar offenders, because of their social status, are especially sensitive to the pains of the criminal justice system, both the process, which they said, well, that's enough punishment, or even if they went to prison or incarceration, that would be a very traumatic experience for them. So Frank and I, were talking about this, and Frank at the time had the idea, he says, well, if you look at the literature that relates to stress and the ability of a person to respond to stress, to overcome stress, all of the characteristics that you think make people specially sensitive, the stress research says makes them resilient. So we thought, well, that's interesting. Is that really true? They're theories. So is that really true? And we wrote the article hoping that someone would pick it up. And now, 20 years after we wrote it, people are starting to actually do research on it.
Let's change directions here for just a minute, and let's talk about becoming a criminologist. Can you tell us a little bit about your life before you turned to academic pursuits?
Yeah, well, I never intended, at least early on, to be a criminologist, or white-collar crime. I can explain later how I got into that particular path, but when I was growing up, I wanted to be a writer. I mean, I wanted to be a fiction writer. My heroes at that time, in the 1950s and 60s, were James Thurber and Robert Benchley, American humorists, and I loved their work. I wanted to do that. I wanted to make people laugh with my writing. So when I went to college at Central Michigan, the very first thing I did was I majored in English. And I didn't do very well at it. Because I found out, I thought majoring in English meant you do a lot of writing. You do a lot of writing, creative writing is what I thought I would do. That's not what you do when you major in English. When you major in English, what you do is you write about other people's writing. You write critical analysis, which I am not particularly good at. And so I kept getting B's in my English classes. And I had to take an elective, and the sociology class that I took, Introduction to Sociology, was, the right time of day, middle of the day, Tuesday, Thursday, not on the weekends, not in the morning.
Fit your schedule, you have to get up early.
Fit my schedule. So I took sociology, and I was just, it just came naturally to me. I just found it easy to do. I didn't even have to study for the exams. I could just figure things out. So after a while, I switched my major from English to sociology, and I started doing sociology. I still didn't have any idea what I was going to do with it. I just knew that I was better at sociology than I was at English. And then I think I had a good friend, and I hope you don't mind if this story's a little long. I had a good friend, and he and I were going to go to law school together. This was in the 1960s. We wanted to become public defenders, fight for the poor and the oppressed and everything. So we graduated from Central Michigan, and we had virtually identical credentials. I had a slightly higher LSAT score than he did. He did slightly better GPA than I did, but we were identical. So we applied to 6 schools together. Everywhere he got in, I didn't get in. Everywhere that I got in, he didn't get in. So, he ended up going off to Antioch School of Law, and I went down to Wake Forest in North Carolina. This is in the 1960s, early 70s. My hair was down to my shoulders. I didn't fit in. I didn't fit in at Wake Forest at all. And I quickly discovered that I didn't like the law at all when I actually was studying it. Despite what they show on TV shows like The Paper Chase and whatnot, it's not fun. I didn't like it at all. And I realized, as I said to you once, quickly, that I'd really be doing a disservice to all my future clients if I actually got a law degree. So then, to flip back to Central Michigan before I left, I had majored all the way in sociology, and I got to the end, and I was a senior, and I was taking this course from a really good theorist named Larry Reynolds, sociological theory. And it was a mixed level course. There was seniors, and there were also master's students in that. It was tough. Larry was a very demanding instructor, huge reading list, complicated lectures. Anyways, so I'm in there, and we'd have our first exam, and it was hard. It was really hard. And Larry comes in, and he's obviously mad about the class after he's graded our exams. And he says, "Let me write the grade distribution on the board." He says, "This was the highest grade in the class. 60, he says, 62. And I'm thinking, oh crap, I'm gonna have to be taking this again. And then he said, and this was made by an undergraduate at the highest grade in the class. It was a 62, but it was the highest grade in the class.
Probably didn't grade on a curve either.
No, he didn't. Larry did not grade on a curve. But he did say, so then afterwards I was asking him, will you write a letter of recommendation for law school? And he said, yeah, he says, I will, but Benson, you're not a lawyer. You never will be. So I expect you back here in a year. And he was right. After I flunked out of law school, I decided I'm going to go back to graduate school, and I did that, and then got my master's at Central Michigan. And only then did I sort of slowly start thinking about myself as a sociologist, start thinking about graduate school. I had the good fortune when I was a master's student to be assigned to Al Liska as his teaching assistant, you know. And Al, as you know, was utterly brilliant,
Yeah.
a sociological criminologist. And Al got me to write my master's thesis under him, and he's the one who really got me thinking about criminology. Yeah.
Where did the interest in white-collar crime come from?
By accident. Again, while I was at the University of Illinois, and I was sort of fairly far along in my career, it's probably in my third or fourth year, I was assigned to work with Rita Simon as her, you know, teaching assistant or graduate assistant. And somebody, a guy, had written to Rita, because Rita had done a lot of work in corrections at that point in time. Okay, a guy had written to Rita, and he was a white-collar offender who had been in prison. He'd actually been in a state prison. And many white-collar offenders, once they go to prison, become very interested in prison reform after they get out. And so he had written to Rita and said that, you know, he was interested in prison reform. He wanted to know if she could meet with him and talk with him and help him get involved in, you know, reforming prisons in Illinois. Rita was too busy to talk to him and really wasn't interested, so she asked me to meet with him. So I did. I met and I interviewed this guy about his experiences in prison. And that's where it dawned on me that I was really interested in how people from a middle-class background, like me, middle-class background, how they would experience prison, how they would go through this whole process of the justice system. So I was interested in that. I was looking for a dissertation topic. And so I asked Rita, I said, you know, I'd like to do more of these. How do I find these guys? And Rita was very good friends with a law professor at Illinois named Prentice Marshall, who was subsequently appointed as a federal judge in Chicago. He worked for the Northern District. You know, he was a chief judge, actually, chief judge of the Northern District. Rita wrote to him and said, you know, I've got a PhD student who would like to talk to people convicted of white-collar crimes. Chief judges are very powerful. He told the probation office, from the U.S. probation office, then, which they had at that point in time, probation and parole office, he told them, cooperate with this guy. So.
Wow, it's so hard to get access.
Well, it is, and now you couldn't do it.
Yeah, right.
I mean, I did this before there were even human subjects reviewed. There was nothing.
No IRBs?
No IRBs, no nothing. I went up, I met with probation officers, I interviewed them, and then I had this idea, I said, I want a whole rounded picture of this. So I met with probation officers, I met with prosecuting attorneys, I met with defense attorneys, I met with, and then from the probation officers, I got access to the offenders, and I went and talked to them. Plus, back then, you won't believe this, but they produced, you know, pre-sentence investigation reports.
That you could have access to.
Yeah, and those are wonderful documents.
Oh,
they are really thorough. They're like 20 pages. They trace everything in the, it's like a life history.
Oh, the Stan Wheeler, David Weisberg stuff used the,
Yeah, which back then you could get access
reports,
to. Now you can't. You can't even get close to it.
Right.
But I got access to some of that, a bunch of those, so I could do some quantitative analysis with and then with all of my interviews. And that
I mean, there's a nice bookend quality to this, Mike, because I happen to know that some of your doctoral students that have just recently finished up
Yes.
are doing very similar things that you did for your
Yes.
dissertation.
Yes, one of my students did something. I had in my sample all men. I had 30 men. There were 2 women who could have responded to me, but the probation officer said they didn't want to. So I didn't interview them. I now have a student who just finished, Diana's son, who was able to locate at least 7 women convicted of things like white-collar crimes, and she was able to interview them and sort of ask them if they had the same types of experiences that I uncovered.
It's nice bookend quality,
Yes,
though, isn't
it
it?
is.
Yeah. So we've kind of talked around this, but specifically criminology was just working with specific people. That is what piqued your interest in criminology within sociology?
I'm not sure. No, I don't think that's quite. I was fortunate to be assigned to Al Liska. Larry Reynolds was not a criminologist. Larry Reynolds was a straightforward symbolic interactionist. He was a theorist. That's all he wanted to do. In fact, I'm sure he was disappointed when I wrote my master's thesis with Al Liska instead of Larry. No, again, I actually started out, once I got to, so I did my master's thesis with Al Liska, which I haven't talked about, but I did that. And then when I got to Illinois, I was still very interested in sociological theory, and I wanted to study the sociology of knowledge. I wanted to be the next Karl Mannheim. You know. And after a while, I realized I'm not the next Karl Mannheim. And again, it was sort of by accident that I got assigned to Rita, you know, and then through Rita, got interested in this white-collar crime topic. I mean, I never had a class in white-collar crime. The University of Illinois had like 2 classes in crime. They had 1 class in penology taught by Larry Reynolds, and then they had Dave Borgia taught a class in deviant behavior. That was it for the criminology section.
I think for a large number of scholars who study white-collar crime, none of us have ever had a class in white-collar crime.
No, we taught ourselves. And I tell my students this sometimes, you know, you don't need a class in something. You need books.
Yes.
Go find the books and read them. You know, this is what you do. Even statistics. I've done, later on in my career, when I had to do certain statistical analyses, I didn't have time to take a class. So I went and taught myself how to do logistic regression because I needed that. And you can do it. You don't need to take it. It's nice to have a class, nice to have someone direct you, but you don't have to have it. You can figure it out yourself.
So criminology was just kind of a haphazard.
Yes, I think I stumbled into.
Okay.
But once I got in there, and once I started studying white-collar crime, and once I went Sutherland, that was the game changer for me. That's when I realized, oh, this is really interesting. There's a lot to do here, and he raised so many questions, you know, and actually being a white-collar crime scholar, I think, is helped my creativity, because whenever something new comes along in criminology, like the life course perspective, biosocial criminology, environmental criminology, community context, whatever comes along in criminology, as a white-collar crime scholar, you can always say, okay, how does that work with white-collar crime? How does that fit? Does it fit? You know, these people are claiming that they have general theories.
General theories, right.
Okay, fine. Well, how does it fit through white-collar crime? I mean, self-control theory, you know, Gottfredson and Hershey made this big deal. Theirs is a general theory of crime, applies to everything. I said, all right, nice claim, let's find out. Let's go take a look and see what we can find out.
Okay, you've talked about your formal educational training. After you received your degree from University of Illinois, that was, did you stop there with your formal educational training?
Pretty much. Some people would say I stopped before I finished. I did. That was after my PhD. Other than, attending workshops, and I went to the Inter-University Consortium for Political Research seminars or workshops that they used to have at the University of Michigan a couple of times to learn about how to do community level analyses. But yeah, that was it. And then I went and got my job at Indiana University, Purdue University at Fort Wayne in the School of Public and Environmental Affairs. I know Sally did better than I did coming out of school, but when I came out, there were not a lot of jobs. It was hard to get a job.
Yeah, criminology was not as popular.
It was
back
not
then.
popular. I know that you and I and like Al Lazat and Gary Kleck were just ahead of me. They got pretty good jobs, but it was hard. And then Al, he didn't get tenured at Indiana University, and he had to leave. So that was the only job I could get. I had interviewed at 3 places in sociology departments, and I finally got hired at Indiana. And that's when I then started writing my articles, Denying the Guilty Mind, and was able to publish my way out of that and go to the University of Tennessee. And by the time I did that, I was identified as a criminologist.
And a white-collar crime scholar.
As a white-collar crime person. So.
Are there any biographical connections between your research agenda and the work that you do?
I saw that question on the guidelines that you gave me, and I thought about it. I'm trying to think, and I think part of it is my middle class background. I came out of the middle class. I think the middle class is very concerned with face, with keeping up one's reputation, and I think that concern with face and reputation and one's public appearance, which I think is something that middle-class people are stuck with. If you're raised in that environment, your parents are always, don't do anything to embarrass me. Don't embarrass me. I think that sort of fed into the way that I looked at the things that I wanted to know about white-collar offenders. That how do they feel about what they do? And how do they feel about being exposed for what they do? I'm still interested in that topic. How do people take the risk to do something that can be really, really embarrassing if it's exposed? And then how do they handle it once it's exposed?
Yeah, right, right. Presumably, it is exposed and they suffer the consequences, but we do know that the law and detection doesn't work quite the same way for white-collar offenders as it does for non-white-collar offenders.
And I've thought about this too. Like, you look at somebody and they get exposed, they get caught for something. You can use white-collar offenders, or you can use sexual offending. Like these powerful men that victimize women, they get exposed, and you think to yourself, like, why in the world would they ever do that? Why are the risks so high? And then I got thinking, well, maybe from their perspective, the risks aren't that high, because they know so many people who have done that and gotten away with it, and they just assume, I'll get away with it. They don't perceive the risk, and it's actually some sort of goof up that they get caught. They make some mistake, they victimize the wrong person, or now with social media, they're exposed that way. And I think that is also true sometimes of white-collar offenders. They may know other people in their business world who've done these things, no problem, gotten away from it. All we get is the tip of the iceberg.
Absolutely. Regarding your body of work, is there a major theme around which all of your work coheres, or are there several smaller agendas?
I don't think there are I don't think there's a major thing, other than I'm interested in how groups and communities affect behavior. you know, that
So that
interest.
pulls together all of your interests.
That's, yeah, I mean, that, everything else feeds out of that. And like I said earlier, I don't deny the importance of individual factors. They're very important. Don't deny individual responsibility. But individuals live in a social world. We have to acknowledge this. We're social animals, and our behavior is profoundly affected by other human beings who are around us. And if we don't acknowledge that, if we just look at the individuals, it's like a misspecified regression equation. You're just leaving out half the important variables when you do that. You know, Marx has something important to say about this. Men make their own lives, but they don't make them under the conditions of their own choosing. Something like that. You know.
I remember when I first met you years and years ago. We were at a conference. Was it the White Collar Crime Conference in Indiana?
Oh, it could have been. Yes.
And I do remember you and I were laughing once we got to know one another that we were the only two people at the conference doing quantitative work on white collar and corporate crime.
That's right.
And you and I were kind of laughing like we are the dinosaurs because everyone else has moved into more qualitative, like in-depth or case study analyses. How do you feel about where you are on your trajectory of fitting into where the field is?
Oh, well, first, I don't worry too much about that. I like to lead the field rather than fit into it. And I actually think you and I were path breakers there. Everybody else had always done the qualitative research, and you and I were the only ones. I remember, you know, at this conference that we were at, I was doing something, and I was looking at community effects, and I had this huge path diagram.
Path diagram, structural equation
all
modeling.
these little boxes and arrows and everything. And afterwards, I was talking to Peter Yeager about that, and he said, I was so jealous that you could explain, you could put up a path diagram. He says, it takes me 5,000 words to explain what I'm talking about. You put up one diagram, and that's it.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, how has your work mentioned, how has the work that you've talked about generated debates or criticism, and how well do you think the work has stood up to those debates and criticisms?
To be honest, I wish it had gotten more criticism than it has. You know, I think my work is cited a lot, but sometimes it's not criticized. The one exception to that, some of the European scholars, Wim Huysman and some of those guys, have taken issue with my sort of opportunity perspective, you know, and have written critical articles about that. And about, I've written about how you can try to affect crime in an area not by doing anything to the offender, but just changing the situational variables surrounding an opportunity. And I said and I used the example of regulation. You know, the regulations change they create and shape criminal opportunities, you know. And Wim and other people, or Wim and his co-authors, thought that wasn't much of an advance. That, you know, they said, well, regulation is just regulation. Why do you think of it as part of opportunities? And I said, because it creates opportunities, you know. If you have a regulation that requires you to keep records of what you do, then not keeping records becomes a potential offense, a potential violation. Okay, so how regulations are written really matters, you know. And if you have a regulation that says, don't do this, you know, you can't pollute the environment, okay? But then there's nothing that requires you to keep track of what you do. And that's a great opportunity. You can pollute the environment and nobody can show that you did it or you violated a rule. But if you are required to keep records, then that creates the paper trail. And a lot of white-collar crime investigations is, you know, come down to paper trails. Who can prove what? You know, and it's the paper trail. And it also comes down to what's interesting about white-collar crime to me is the way that it always feeds off of legitimate business practices. And that really complicates its control. Because, as you know, in our system of justice, you have to prove not only that somebody did something, you have to prove that they knew what they were doing was wrong.
Right.
And it's easy for white-collar offenders to say, it was a mistake. I didn't know what I was doing was wrong, you know.
Right.
I remember an attorney that I interviewed, a prosecuting attorney that I interviewed in Chicago said this. He says, you know, everybody agrees about what happened. Everybody agrees that this person gave this piece of paper to this guy, and he signed it, and he made this telephone call. What people disagree about is what was in their heads when that happened.
Yeah. Okay. To what do you attribute the sustaining presence of your work in the field?
Well, I hope it's just, I don't know.
I mean, the fact that this piece, Denying the Guilty Mind, is still being cited today, and it was published in 1982?
82, yeah. One, I think it's because it's sort of a founding effect. It was the first piece, and
So you're the Sutherland of Denying the Guilty Mind.
Yeah, it took neutralization. I hit neutralization theory at exactly the right time. It had just come out and it had been applied to juvenile delinquents. But in their book, or in their article, Sykes and Monza specifically mentioned white-collar type crimes, but nobody had done it.
No one had drilled down.
So I had done it, I did it, and that, I think now, it just becomes a pro forma citation. You have to cite that work, you know. Otherwise, reviewers will criticize you.
Right.
You didn't cite this work.
Right.
And I also think it raised some interesting, it made some interesting points. What I thought was interesting there was not the fact that offenders use neutralizations, which I called accounts, okay, but the fact that the accounts are shaped by the nature of the offense. Depending on what you do, you can only excuse it in particular ways.
Right.
You can't embezzle by accident.
True.
You know, you have to come up with another excuse. There's other excuses, but it can't be by accident. On the other hand, you can violate the tax laws by accident.
Right.
You know, it's not an excuse, but you can do it by accident.
Right.
You know,
And that can be part of your account.
part of the account. So I think that was, one of that to me was the more interesting part of that piece, and also trying to show how all of this fits within, and the sort of accounts become possible or acceptable within a capitalistic society, and they wouldn't fit in another society. And again, that's just how the community shapes how we think and explain our behaviors.
Okay, let's move into yet another different direction. Would you have done anything differently in your career if you'd had the opportunity? If you could go back and relive it?
If I could go back, I would have done one thing differently. And it has nothing to do with my scholarship. I'm happy with the way my scholarship, I'm delighted and surprised and proud with the way my scholarship's turned out. But if I had to do something different, and this may sound odd, I wish I had gotten more involved in campus life when I was a younger professor. I holed myself up in my room, I wrote, I looked on my computer, I read all the time. I didn't get involved in undergraduate student activities, I didn't go to graduations very much, except when I had doctoral students. And the more I think about it, that was a mistake. I think not taking advantage of what a wonderful place college campuses are, and to get more involved with younger students. If I had it to do over, I would have changed that. I would have, maybe served as an undergraduate director, maybe, just gotten more involved with undergraduates.
Do you think that was the pressure of getting articles out and being promoted and tenured?
Oh yeah, some of it was. I mean, definitely especially when I got to Cincinnati, and well, even at Tennessee, yeah, you had to publish to get out and, to guarantee yourself tenure. So there is a lot of pressure there. which is unfortunate, because I think sometimes the most good you can do for your students is actually interacting with them outside of the classroom, not in the classroom, but just talking to them so they get to see you as a person who thinks in a particular way. I know when I took classes from Al Liska, and Al was a great teacher, and I learned a lot about theories of deviance from him. But I learned more by sitting in his office, and he just talked to me about how he would think about problems. He always said something to me, like we'd be talking, he'd say, like, let's stop. Let's just think about this for a minute. And he'd pause and we'd try to figure out what was going on. And I still do this now with my doctoral students. I say, don't just jump into data analysis. Stop for a minute. Think. What are you trying to explain? How are you trying to explain? Think about yourself. How would you, if you were in this situation, if you were a woman being abused, how would you respond? Why? What would influence your behavior? That was helpful.
Well, this then takes us to the issue of mentoring. What is your mentoring philosophy? And I can say, because you have mentored some of my former students as assistant professors, and they think you're terrific. They think you're a wonderful mentor. So what is your philosophy about mentoring?
Okay. I thought about this too. My philosophy is support without nagging. When I'm mentoring graduate students or younger professors, I take it seriously, and I try to show that I'm taking it seriously by responding quickly to everything that they send. If they send me an email, I respond. If they send me a paper to review, I review it, I mark it up as much as I can, and I send it back to them as quickly as I can. But I don't nag my graduate students. When a student approaches me and says they want to work on their dissertation with me, I say, that's fine. I'm behind you 100%, but I'm not nagging you to get something done. If you send me something, I will get it back to you within 2 days. I will do it as quickly as I can. And I will try to help you think. I'll ask that question. Let's think about this for a minute. What's going on? Why? What's the best way to explain this? You have all these results. Results are boring. You have to make them tell a story. What's the best way to explain these results? And I try to do that as much as I can. I try to edit their writing as much as I can to help them find the clearest and simplest way of explaining something. I spend a lot of my time crossing out big words. You don't need big words. You don't need adjectives and adverbs all the time. Just get rid of
paragraph-length sentences.
Yeah. I have a lecture that I give about the length of sentences, and I show them a sentence written by John Updike that is beautiful. It's a paragraph long. It's gorgeous. And I tell them, if you can write that, you don't need me. But since none of you can write that, you need me.
What would you suggest to future generations of scholars who are going to be watching this recording? What would you like to say to them? What would you tell them about what it takes to be successful in this field?
Okay. A couple of things. As I mentioned, you have to learn how to write. And writing is a skill that can be mastered. Some people are really great at it. I'm never going to write as well as Jack Katz used to write, or Todd Gitlin used to write. Those guys, okay, they're up in a league by themselves. But you can learn to write clearly. But it doesn't happen by accident. You have to work at it. So the first thing I'd say is you got to read a lot. You have to read good writers. When I was first starting out, the person that I admired was Robert Merton. I remember reading everything he wrote, and not for the content, not for the ideas, although I did that too, but just for how did he say things. I remember once reading 5 of his articles, just looking at the first sentence. How did he write his first sentence? Because he hooked you.
Yeah.
In the very first sentence, you're hooked.
Yeah.
You said, oh, what's coming next? You know, you have to learn how to tell stories. So you have to write and work. And I have a shelf that's maybe this big of books on writing that I have gone through. Everybody's looked at the elements of style, strong and light. Great place to start. Don't stop there. There's all kinds of other stuff. And I always tell my students that you need to read all. I said, don't read these as manuals. Don't read them as this is how it's done. Just read through them and pick up ideas that resonate with you, that you like, you know, and try to work those principles into your writing. And for me, it's always strive for clarity and simplicity. Don't make it a struggle for them. Don't try to sound smart. Try to sound clear.
Well, let me ask you a question, because I do think this is interesting. I have said to my colleagues over the years that I used to feel like I had a style to my writing, and it's become so much more template focused. If you're writing an article, you need the parsimonious introduction, you need the statement of the research problem, you need the research questions you're interested in, and everything becomes so pro forma that you lose what creates the individuality in the writing.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I agree that the article form is deadly. You know, but you're right. You have to write it. You do have. I tell my students, you get 2 pages. By the end of the second page, you better explain why this is worth reading.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
you've got to get there quickly. But you have to tell a story somehow. You have to make it a story. I always, I tell students, remember, you're writing about people. You're not writing about variables. People manifest variables, but you're still writing about people. So try not to always think about the variables that you're writing about.
I'll tell you a story about this. A long time ago, Bob Agnew wrote a book called Why Did They Do It?
Which I thought was a brilliant title. And I reviewed the pre-publication of that, you know. And they changed the title. They changed the title into variable speak, you know. And I just thought, like, oh man, this, you know, it just makes it so uninteresting. It was something like, you know, what makes criminals offend?
Ben, yes, I remember that. Mm-hmm.
Why do criminals offend? And I thought, first of all, nobody speaks that way. Why do they do it? That's, we understand. But
Yeah.
what makes criminals offend? I mean, Jesus. That was, so, and another thing, besides taking writing seriously, you know, not just your ideas, but expressing your ideas, you have to read a lot. And I read a lot. And I read a lot outside of criminology. I probably read more outside of criminology. And that's where some of my best ideas come from. The book on life course criminology came out of, in some ways, out of decades of reading about genetics, you know, and environmental, what's it called? Environmental genetics, you know, how the genome is shaped by the environment and whatnot. I read a lot there, and then so when I started to think about the life course, that part was already plugged in. You know, I could just think, okay, I'm going to write about genes. And then, because genes only do at most 50% of any important phenotype, then I'm going to bring in everything else. You know. But that, I didn't start out reading the genetic stuff because I wanted to write a book on life course criminology. Reading the genetic stuff gave me the idea to write a book on life course criminology. So I would encourage students to read a lot and read fiction too. Novelists are very good at talking about why people do what they do and the things that are in their heads. And all of those can become just for theorizing, you know.
Germs of ideas.
Germs of ideas. And that's one of the things I like about qualitative research. It's true, qualitative research can't prove anything, but it can give you ideas that can then be quantified, and then you can, really try to use the, cause and effect, time ordering, and all that kind of stuff to prove causality. But you get your ideas from the qualitative research, to me.
What are your general thoughts about the intellectual or professional state of the field?
I don't know exactly how to respond to that. One thing that has surprised me, that I've noticed more and more, is the number of articles that are written by these huge teams of people, 4, 5, 6, 7 co-authors. I don't know what to do with that. I don't know how you review, or how you rate the importance of a person's contribution. I kind of wish people would do a little bit more on their own. I do think there are things that criminologists are going to have to recognize, with genetics being one of them, biosocial criminology. I think it's unavoidable. We're going to have to we're going to have to be willing to consider that. And we're going to have to be willing to consider it at all stages. There's no reason to think that genetics affects only offending. If there are genetic effects on people's likelihood of responding, in a criminal manner to a situation, there's also got to be genetic effects on things like enforcement. Why not? Who becomes a police officer? Why do they become a police officer? There's an interesting study right there. We have all these studies showing, the parents of kids of criminal parents become enforcement effects. Who becomes a law enforcement? Why do they become law enforcement? Is there a genetic component to entering the field of law enforcement?
For all those whole studies on authoritarian personality, right?
All of that stuff, that's there too. And then I started a book on emotions. And I called it Emotions, Crime, and Criminal Justice, because I wanted to write about not only the effects of emotions on crime, but the effects of emotions on the enforcement of the law. We see this all the time. Police officers, if you talk to a police officer, why did you shoot that person? I was afraid. Okay, well, that's interesting. Why? Why were you afraid? You had the gun. Not the black kid running away from you. You had the gun. Why were you afraid? Why did that emotion? And if we take them at their face value, that they're not lying, that they did feel fear, then that's an important thing to study. What are the conditions in which fear is provoked in law enforcement agents to such a degree that they're willing to take another person's life?
One of the things I'm thinking of as you're talking is how corporate executives and people within corporations respond to regulators when regulators come and do their inspections and find that the companies are in non-compliance, for instance. And I've talked to some regulators who have said to me, actually women who are in these leadership roles tend to be more reasonable and sympathetic in the way that they interact with regulators. They get less defiant, they get less angry, and that may explain potentially why, if you're looking at women in leadership positions, why companies may have lower offending levels if you've got women in these positions, for instance. So I'm thinking about the kind of defiance theory that Larry Sherman and other people have developed, and applying it to the authorities rather than to...
Right.
Yeah,
thank you. That's exactly in this book that I got 5 chapters written.
There's another chapter.
There, I talk about Larry's work, and I want to generalize it, just as you did say. It's not just offenders, it's everybody else. Most people don't like to be told what to do. They don't like to be pushed around, Women are probably better at handling it than men, by far, at deflecting it or shifting it around, but everybody feels it to a degree. And those, to me, these are important things that I think criminologists need to explore, or at least work them into their models. I don't think we need any more studies of self-control. We've had enough studies of self-control. We probably don't need any more studies of strain or social learning theory. But we do need studies of how genetics may affect those things, or genetic or emotions may affect self-control, something like that.
So those are questions you think the field should be turning its attention to?
Yeah, that's, if I had another 40 or 50 years.
That's what you would be doing.
That's what I would be doing. I finished my book on emotions. That's what I would be doing. I tend to I follow the things that interest me, rather than necessarily, I don't necessarily look at what's being published and think, how can I contribute? I just always start with what interests me. I'm interested in this.
We've talked about some of the influences that you had when you were going through school. Are there people that have had an impact on you and your career outside of the influences in graduate school?
Yeah. When I was at Tennessee, Neil Shover was my colleague. Neil Shover really did have an impact on me. Even though Neil Shover was a difficult colleague sometimes, he was very helpful in editing my writing and in supporting me in my early NIJ applications, the grant that I got to study local prosecutors, and Neil was instrumental in helping me write that. So he meant a lot to me. Obviously, Frank Cullen, I got to know Frank when I was at Tennessee. We hit it off well, and it was just, we co-authored since then. Frank once put together a CV of just our joint publications. It would get tenure. It might even get full professor at most schools. And of course, working with you, because I think it's fair to say that your approach to white-collar crime is a little different than mine. You're more interested in the big corporations and things like that than I have always been. And I've really appreciated that. I think that makes our book, it makes it a little bit for everybody, So those are the three non-faculty or non-mentors that I think have meant the most to me by far. And I would encourage other people, one, do some of your own work. Don't always get involved in these teams of thousands. But if you find somebody who's really good that you click with, work with them. Sykes and Matza work together, Benson and Simpson. Simpson and Benson.
I think it's Benson and Simpson. But do you think that this, 8, 10 people on publications, because of the pressure to get tenure and the expectations that I think many of our junior faculty have, that they have to have so many publications?
I do. I am stunned. Over the course of the last 10 years at Cincinnati, I've been on various search committees where we look at the applications come in, and I look at these young people. They're either ABDs or just out, and they have way more publications than I had when I came out. I had like 6, maybe, and they have 20s and 30s,
But what do you think of this tendency, this
I don't like it.
trend?
I don't like it.
What do you tell your students about that?
Well, tell them you gotta get a lot of publications, and I try to help them. But I also tell them, you have to do more than just publish. You have to come up with some idea or some contribution that makes it different. You gotta tell us something we didn't know beforehand. We don't need to know, yet again, that self-control accounts for 0.24 beta in whatever regression equation that you have, you know. You've got to come up with something different. And I don't know how to get around this because you're on search committees or promotion and tenure committees, and they too much of the time, they end up counting, you know. How many publications do you have? Maybe they multiply it by an impact factor or something, but they seem rarely to, promotion and tenure committees and search committees rarely seem to read it and say, is this important at all? Does it do anything?
Yeah.
I don't know how you feel about that. Can I ask that question?
I think that our students are unfortunately overly anxious about the count. And I inform my students that if they have a couple of well-placed and potentially influential pieces that reflect their individual work, that will bode better for them in terms of, I think, getting someone's attention and maybe getting a job at a good place than having a list of publications where you can't tell what the contribution is or what the role was on the contribution. So, you know, quality matters, and that's what I try to tell students. But you know, sometimes they're constrained by geography, and sometimes they won't go to certain places, and so you know, part of it is what they're willing to do, where they're willing to go, those kinds of things.
Yeah. Well, I emphasize the quality part of things, but I also say I'll try to help you get publications if I can. But you do need to think about, you know, what are your ideas? What do you really want to say that you think is important?
You know, we came out of graduate school, I think, when the book model was very influential. People wrote books, and they wrote influential books. And you and I probably read the same books that David Weisberg read, that, you know, this generation of people read in sociology. And I'm wondering if the shift away from books toward articles has changed what people do, the way they think about problems. I've thought about this a fair amount.
You know, I think you're probably correct. I remember, you write, you know, you write Mills, you write Power of Elite.
Right, exactly.
You write a book that matters. But, yeah. And the other thing is there are now so many journals that you can get a lot of publications, again, without really making any major
contribution.
Or even just a minor contribution as opposed
Something that
to,
someone's going to say, this is interesting.
yeah, this is interesting. I really want to know this, or I want to, this raises questions in my mind, you know.
Well, Mike, is there anything I haven't asked you that you think should be included on the record?
No, you've been a very diligent interviewer. No, it's been a pleasure to talk about these things, and I hope that some of the viewers find something in what I've said here to be valuable. I mean, the main thing I'd say, for me, I'm lazy, so I do what interests me. You know, I don't like to study things that don't interest me. I don't, you know.
But that's the beauty of an academic career, though.
Yeah. It is, although I'll tell one other story. Well, I mentioned when I was at Illinois, they had 2 criminology classes, and one was taught by Larry Cohen. It was on penology, and I'll never forget this. He walked into class, and the very first thing he said was, "I hate penology." You know? This is because he was just starting to get into routine activities with markets,
okay.
and they had forced him to teach this penology. Now, the class that he taught was actually great, I read David Rothman, The Discovery of the Asylum, a couple other great books, you know, and I wrote afterwards, I said, actually, this class was much better than you thought it was. But he was an example to me. He was done with penology, he'd gotten into routine activities theory, and that's what he was going to do, and that's what he liked. And I admired that in him, that he was interested in something else, and he just went to pursue it, you know. And he and Felsen had a hell of a time getting that article published, you know.
And then it's been so influential.
Yeah, it was rejected at Criminology. It was rejected at the American Journal of Sociology. The only reason it got into ASR was because Joan Huber was the editor then. And Joan Huber was at Illinois and was friends with Larry, and she kind of pushed it through. So I also tell my students that, you know, don't give up just because an article gets rejected. I have an article that appeared in the Journal of Research in Crime and Delinquency, that one on are white-collar offenders really the same? You know? I sent that to Criminology. Tittle ripped it apart, rejected it, went nowhere, could not get it published. I finally got it into Research in Crime and Delinquency. It's now got 300 or 400 citations, you know. So you have to have some confidence in your ideas, you know, and don't. Reviewers they try to do the best they can, but they're not always right.
Oh, absolutely,
Right.
Absolutely. Okay, well, Mike, it's been a joy to do this. I was waiting for you to tell me something that I didn't know, a little nugget of something that you hadn't shared with me before, given our long friendship.
I hope I've shared some nuggets.
Thank you.